Jordan Peterson's recent announcement on the Joe Rogan podcast might just be something that changes the world. Now, normally I'm not really somebody to jump to conclusions too quickly. I like to let things play out first before I have a big opinion about it. But this is different. This is something that I'm predicting will be massive. And I will explain that to you in great detail in this video. So with that, let's hear from Jordan Peterson about his announcement.
I tweeted out, I don't know if you saw this, that I was going to make an announcement on your show today. And so I set up an international consortium based in London. I can't tell you all the details yet, but we're trying to put together something like an alternative vision of the future, say an alternative to that kind of apocalyptic narrative that's being put forward, at least implicitly, by organizations like the WEF, and that's the virginal planet, rapacious tyrant, all-devouring consumer religion. And it's more like something like, well, we want to ask people 6 key questions. Okay, so how do we get energy and resources at the lowest possible cost, as rapidly as possible, to the largest number of people around the world? That's one question. And so there's a presumption in the question, and here's one of the presumptions. You don't get to save the planet by making energy prices so expensive that no one poor can afford them. That's off the table. So if you want to develop alternative energy sources, no problem. Because, hey, man, the more energy sources we have, the better. But you don't get to impose your utopian vision in the service of your narcissism on the poor. We're going to try to make the poor rich, going to try to alleviate absolute poverty. Pro-human view on environmental stewardship front. That's the next question. What are the major problems that are confronting us? How do we take a sophisticated multidimensional view of that? How do we prioritize our attempts to establish our states and our international relationships properly so that we prioritize human well-being, in harmony with nature to the degree that's possible, but human-focused and not predicated on the idea that there are too many goddamn mouths on the planet to feed and that you're evil if you just think about having children. So then on the governance front, this is where it gets kind of more left-wing, I would say, is none of the people involved in this consortium so far are very thrilled with global corporate fascist government media and corporation collusion. And we're seeing this at the high end. It's like a Tower of Babel, is that the powerful players in the world are increasingly collaborating to impose a top-down vision of the future on everyone. And that's a future that's predicated on a zero-growth model. And the idea that, well, we'd need 5 planets really to support everyone at the current standard of living that obtains in the West. So the best pathway forward is to deny loans by the World Bank to developing countries so they can't develop, energy sources, which all that'll mean is they're going to burn wood and coal, obviously. So that's the third question is, how do we arrange systems of governance to stop the march of something like pathological gigantism? This is why I like people like Russell Brand and also you to some degree politically, because you guys are very, what would you say, sensitive to the danger of that kind of corrupt collusion, that regulatory capture that occurs when corporate entities and media entities and governmental entities are all in bed together, like the FDA and the CDC and so forth and so on without end. So that's the third question. The fourth question is, what do we put forward as a vision on the family policy front to facilitate the, what would you call it, the encouragement and the maintenance of long-term monogamous couples who are child-centered, and to make increasing the birth rate part of that policy, to put policies in place that would support long-term stable monogamous families, 2-parent families, and child-centered. Because in the West, because we're very immature, we think that the purpose of a marriage is the happiness of the people who are involved in the marriage, the husband and the wife. And that's just not the purpose of marriage at all. The purpose is long-term facilitation of their psychological and spiritual development and the establishment of an environment that's beneficial to children. That's a responsible way of thinking about it. And so we need to have a serious conversation about what that means. And, it's tricky because, I think the ideal has to be long-term committed monogamous heterosexual relationships. And I had a big conversation about this with Dave Rubin. Rubin's gay and he's married, and him and his partner now have 2 infants, and we talked through how that was. It was a very hard thing for them to arrange, obviously. Why? Well, they're both male. So that poses a severe problem on the reproductive front, right? And so they manage that, and they have 2 infants, but it's very complex, and it's obviously not a solution to the problem of relationship and reproduction that's duplicatable across large numbers of people. It just takes too many resources. Now, I do think we have to have an ideal at the center of every concept. But the ideal can't be too rigid, because people aren't perfect. In my own family, there's lots of people who are divorced. In lots of people's families, there are people who are gay. There are lots of people in unhappy marriages. Nobody attains the ideal. So the ideal has to be surrounded by a fringe of tolerance, but that doesn't mean you sacrifice the ideal. And the ideal has to be, well, we know there's a literature on fatherlessness. It's a bloody catastrophe, fatherlessness.
Okay, guys, if I tried to unpack everything that he just said, it would take me days. So I'm going to make this as quick as possible, and I'm going to do follow-up videos in the next few weeks regarding these topics, because every sentence that he's basically saying requires a whole video. But here's a high-level overview. What Jordan Peterson is essentially fighting against is the ideology of Malthusianism. For those of you who don't know what Malthusianism is an idea that came about from a man named Thomas Malthus in the 19th century. The basic premise behind Malthusianism is that population growth is exponential while food and other resources are linear. He also believed that war is a good thing because it kills off the people and we won't be constrained by limited resources, amongst other pathological ideas. And unfortunately, Malthusianism made a comeback in the 20th century. In 1968, a group called the Club of Rome was formed. The Club of Rome, which was formed by a man named David Rockefeller, amongst others, published a book called Limits to Growth in 1972. Limits to Growth was basically the Malthusian ideology repackaged for the modern day. And this book was a huge, huge success. In 1991, they published another paper called The First Global Revolution. This paper suggested that there needed to be a centralization of power and decision-making in the world to combat these crises that we were facing, or in other words, a one-world government. Take a quick step back now into 1971, where Klaus Schwab formed the World Economic Forum. The same year, some would say coincidentally, some would say not, that the USA went off the gold standard and on to its current fiat currency. Now, the World Economic Forum was called the European Management Forum until 1987, but it was essentially the same thing. And Klaus Schwab was heavily influenced by the Malthusian ideology and especially by the Club of Rome. Another example that just coincidentally happened in 1968, the same year that the Club of Rome was founded, was that Paul Ehrlich published The Population Bomb. The Population Bomb was another very popular book that warned of the perils of overpopulation. Some of the things that he warned about was mass starvation, societal upheaval, and environmental deterioration. Well, unfortunately for Ehrlich, none of it came true. And unfortunately for the Malthusians in the Club of Rome, etc., none of their predictions came true either. But we all know that ideologues never let the truth get in the way of a good power grab. So even though our population kept on increasing, and with this population increase came also an increase in wealth and living standards of developing nations, as well as declining infant mortality rates, more access to clean drinking water, and also the greening of the world, the Malthusians are still at it, which should tell you something about what their real motive is. And the way that this is manifesting in today's day and age is through the World Economic Forum and through the climate emergency narrative. It's all the same thing that's been happening for decades, but repackaged for the modern once again. The annual meeting in Davos in the Swiss Alps every year of the World Economic Forum is basically collusion with the biggest corporations in the world, the biggest governments in the world, and the biggest media entities in the world. And this is what Jordan Peterson is talking about when he refers to the global fascist collusion between government, media, and corporations. And it's also what he's referring to when he talks about pathological gigantism. And you might think, oh, fascist, that's strong language, but this is a case where it's actually very appropriate. Because one of the key aspects of fascism is when government, corporations, and media are all working in lockstep together. And just one stat for you, from the year 2000 to the year 2015, the global rate of absolute abject poverty by the UN standard, which is $1.99 a day US, was halved in those 15 years. We have been making unbelievable strides, and we should be focusing on continuing to do so because it's so unbelievably positive. Yet we have these Malthusians who are willing to sacrifice the poor in order to cut CO2 emissions and solve the climate crisis. When you understand the ideology of Malthusianism and the dehumanist sentiment behind Malthusianism and how the lineage of that movement has culminated into today, you may come to your own conclusion about what the hidden motives might be. So, when Jordan Peterson talks about getting energy to the developing world for as cheap as possible, being environmental stewards through a pro-human lens, and increasing the birth rate, that flies in the face of the dehumanist Malthusian ideology. So essentially, what this movement will be, in my opinion, from what I can see, is a direct counter to the Malthusian ideology, a direct counter to the World Economic Forum. It will be a gathering of extremely powerful and wise people from around the globe with a pro-human view on the world. A group with a vision to increase prosperity in the developing world and ultimately in the Western world as well. And you may be very skeptical about this, and so am I, but it's not the first time in history that a group of wise people have gotten together and changed the course of history through discussing ideas. And what I'm referring to is the American Constitution. When the Founding Fathers, when those great men got together and formed that constitution based on Greek rationale and logic and Judeo-Christian morality, the American Constitution, which is the greatest political document of all time, was created. And I understand that that comparison is quite speculative, but who's to say that if some of the best minds in the world were to get together, like he's essentially talking about now, and discuss how to make the world a better and more prosperous place, that it couldn't be a historical moment? I think it could. Thank you so much for watching, guys. If you would like access to uncensored, exclusive content and to join the Rattlesnake TV community and support the channel so that I can bring the best content possible to you as often as possible, then please consider hitting the link in the bio, rattlesnaketv.locals.com, and support the channel. And if you want to watch another clip, click right here. And if you want to subscribe to the channel, if you get value from these videos, then click right here. Until next time, I'm Jake. This is Rattlesnake TV.